is Reason Revolution. I'm your host, Justin Clark. Thank you so much for joining us this week. This week, I spoke with Reece, the creator of the YouTube channel Nightmare Fuel. He is one of the most interesting and iconoclastic voices in the secular movement, and I was so excited to have him on the show. In our conversation, we talked about the recent Steven Pinker controversy, Reece's upbringing and path to atheism and anti-theism, problems associated with the extreme left and the alt-right, the value of compromise and citizenship in a democracy, the importance of a sound foreign policy, and much, much more. I really enjoyed our chat and look forward to chatting with Reece in the future. I definitely consider him a compatriot in this space. So, here's my interview with Reece from Nightmare Fuel. Reece, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. We've been meaning to do this for a while, so I'm glad we could finally get around to it.
Likewise, I discovered your YouTube channel a little while back, and I was, needless to say, I was pretty impressed. I think you're a very articulate voice in the skeptic movement, and I wanted to make sure to get you on the show because I think you're doing some really excellent work with your YouTube channel.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Absolutely. And I wouldn't be against talking about it or myself, not to be completely egotistical.
No, that sounds great.
It's a great opportunity to maybe explain some things. I've always just liked podcasts in general, just as a format and as a platform. It gives more room for people to articulate themselves, and even perhaps on YouTube.
I completely agree. That's one of the beauties of it. And I love having these conversations. When I started getting into this space, so as a profession, I'm a public historian. And one thing I always wanted to do, because I learned about doing some of this in graduate school, was the process of oral history. And I thought about doing this project forever ago called the Free Thought Oral History Project, where I would basically find as many different types of people who are either atheist, agnostic, anti-theist, skeptic, free thinker, whatever, and interview them about their lives and their beliefs. And I was originally going to have that as a podcast idea, and then it sort of eventually morphed into a couple other projects, and now it's this. So this is sort of the best of both worlds. I get to sort of talk to people and get a sense of what their upbringing was like and sort of how they came to be who they are, and then kind of talk to them about what they're doing now. So so this is going to be, I think, excellent to do that with you as I have with other guests.
I'm totally down. Behind
Awesome.
The mask. Reece edition.
I like it. Behind the skull.
You don't want to know what's back there.
All right. Well, before we get real started, I just wanted to get your sort of quick assessment of the whole Steven Pinker situation. For those listening, Steven Pinker did a forum, which was a component of something called Learn Liberty, and it was Spike Magazine, where he sort of talked about how that there's sort of universal truths about human nature and life that sort of often get glossed over by sort of the more sort of social justice left. And because of that, it can gravitate what he described as being sort of articulate people to the alt-right. And of course, your usual suspects got their panties in a bunch. Of course, P.Z. Myers called him a right-wing shitweasel. Which is no surprise. That's P.Z. Myers for you. I'm waiting for Steve Shives to say whatever bullshit he's going to say too. But I thought it was pretty unfair. And then I know Jesse Singal wrote a great editorial about it, basically saying, like, this is what happens when social media sort of turns people into dogmatic fools and simpletons and doesn't really get into the heart of what Steven Pinker was actually saying. So I'd just like to get your quick thoughts about that whole situation.
Well, I think there's a lot of blame to go around. So you're obviously going to have the P.Z. Myers crowd, who very closely fit the profile of who Steven Pinker is criticizing in the first place.
I agree.
So these are people who no self-awareness whatsoever. These are people who routinely deny the nature of human beings and how tribalistic they can be, and the great challenges that we face being a socially tribal species like we are. On the other side, I saw people of the far right, alt-right, nationalist persuasion using that to say, oh, this is what Steven Pinker's saying. He's saying that the alt-right is smart and therefore it's right. It's right about everything it has to say. And that's also not really. So it's another case where you have a public intellectual being taken out of context by both sides to feed their agenda, to twist his words into what they would like to hear, what would help them. Steven Pinker, as far as I could tell, was very much saying that people in the alt-right who are smart and articulate, their placement in the political movement is a little unorthodox because of that. And it's kind of, it offers cover to a movement that comes up with a lot of simple solutions. I just don't understand how people don't understand that context. Yeah. He's saying that people, they're smart despite being in the alt-right. There are many people, Richard Spencer is a great example, the founder, or at least the person who coined the term alt-right, very articulate, very well-spoken. He's very practiced in selling his bullshit. That doesn't mean he's right. There's a very big difference.
Exactly. And that was the point I think Pinker was making, which was this idea that, hey, these people who would otherwise be, in some respects, I think a little bit more reasonable in terms of our political discourse, because there are people who sort of deny some sort of basic fundamental facts about the world, some of the, and his facts were pretty simple and they're not controversial at all. The fact that capitalism on the whole tends to work better than socialism, the fact that men and women prefer different things, the fact that violence does vary by ethnic group. But he makes a great point of saying a century ago, you would see high rates of crime or violence within the Irish population of the United States. So it's not to say that can't change in the future. He's actually offering people a blueprint for using this sociological research as a means for sort of critiquing and curtailing the success of the alt-right. It was actually, I think in many ways, it was sort of a slam of the alt-right that didn't come from sort of the SJW left perspective. And because I'm a huge fan of Steven Pinker, and I read his book, The Blank Slate, earlier this year, which I think is a masterwork. And I think to me, it's a book that everybody should really read to get a sense of how our politics have gotten so gross because we deny things about human nature, because we deny things about some fundamental basics about who we are and how we interact with one another and how societies work. And so, to me, it just seems like that was what happened. And he couldn't have happened to a better person. I mean, this is a guy who is a huge Democratic donor. He describes himself as being sort of a centrist. He's not like a crazy radical guy. I mean, Steven Pinker is, to me, in many ways, criticisms aside, is like the living embodiment of like the nice, reasonable guy. So it just seems to me like that if this can happen to Steven Pinker of all people, then it can happen to anybody.
Oh, sure. And I very much sympathize with where he's coming from. And I know what it feels like to be under the magnifying glass of people like P.Z. Myers. I've made it a point, especially in recent months, to at least dedicate some videos and streams to, okay, this is what I can agree with when it comes to people who I'm very politically separated from. So those are going to be standard conservatives and alt-righters alike. I think that there is a lot to be gained from, okay, I'm going to acknowledge that this is an undeniable fact. This is true. You don't have to necessarily throw out the baby with the bathwater. And that happens all the time in these conversations because people, my political enemies are talking about that. Therefore, every aspect of that is unusable. I can't even acknowledge any truth in it, or else I'm just like them. And that's a very dangerous mindset because it is leading to just idiocracy, especially in online social circles. You'll see the denial of the most basic facts about like intelligence, for example, and you really have to wonder where the discourse is going. I've always made a point that I don't want the alt-right to have a monopoly on any given topic, especially a topic like immigration, genetics integrated with intelligence, anything like that. These are major social issues that deserve all sides offering their positions. We can't just say, oh, that topic's off limits. You can't talk about that at all because this one side that we don't like is talking about that, or they're talking about the issue. And that was very clearly demonstrated here.
I couldn't agree more. And that's part of the problem. What's funny is that, even myself, because I'm as like I'm a public figure in this space now, and I've sort of had certain opinions. I've changed my mind in real time. I like describing what I do as sort of thinking out loud in public, and and there needs to be a real sense of a dedication to reason, which is it's why my show is called what it is that there's so much romanticism in our politics. It reminds me very much of, as a student of the 19th century, it's what I study in intellectual history. You see this sort of romanticism in our politics where people want to buy into sort of these grand, sweeping, romantic narratives about, equality or peace or love or justice or things like that. And the problem is that these sort of romantic narratives often get us away from the real nuts and bolts of like actually doing the work of making things better. I recently watched the movie All the Way, the movie about Lyndon Johnson. And, Lyndon Johnson was one of those guys who was definitely a liberal, argued for social progress, but he was also one of those people who was like, this is how you get it done. This is how you get the votes. You have to cajole this person. You have to assuage this person. You got to make this person go your way. Like he was a deal maker. He was somebody who was willing to sort of get down in the muck of it and really actually work to do something. And that's really the problem I see sometimes in this space politically is there's a lot of people sort of blowing smoke or blowing hot air, but they often don't understand the sort of pragmatic dynamics of how like government works and how it's compromises, and you have to sort of take 3 steps forward, 1 step back. It's not perfect. And that to me sort of smells of religion in a lot of ways. And I find myself being very, very dismayed by it.
There is a very sickening sense of dogmatism in it. Basically, the chances of your political side being right all the time are next to none. But everyone acts like their side is infallible. And that's the first step to just failure in my mind. It's a dedication to every single narrative that your political side pushes. And there was definitely a point a couple of years ago, I was much more progressively minded in that sense, and very much against compromise. And as time goes on, the chinks in your side's armor start to become a lot more apparent. And I do believe in social progress in many ways, and I think that there's a lot that can be done. However, I don't expect any of it to happen overnight.
No.
And that seems to be the expectation of a lot of people. And honestly, I hate to say it, I would say the majority.
Yeah, I think you're right. And part of that is, earlier this year, I read Mark Lilla's The Once and Future Liberal, which is a terrific book. And he sort of makes this point of saying that one of the problems with this sort of notion of sort of woke in sort of the colloquial sense in the culture is that that's religious language. It's not really political language. And he sort of makes a point of it's okay to have the Sermon on the Mount, but remember that at the end of the day, you actually have to have institutional power. You actually have to do the hard work of making things happen. And I think that's the thing that troubles me.
A lot of people who are more progressively minded, when they address this topic, I see that they like to try to skip this step. So they'll make a claim, something along the lines, we can do both. See, we don't need the compromise. Our politics are so popular, we would have won anyway. Our candidates are a shoo-in. They'll say this of any of the Justice Democrat nominees. They'll say this of Bernie Sanders with a very dogmatic assuredness that in today's troubled political scene, I would not be saying anything that matter of fact, honestly. It's people far too sure of themselves. And that's a problem because that they then get around the issue entirely. I don't need to compromise. My politics are the most popular. If I just, preach the party line, if I just buy into every narrative, we're going to win anyway. We don't need to persuade other people through reason or through debate. We could persuade them through punching, and then we'll figure it out in 2 years.
Yeah, and see that's really the tough nature of it. For me, And part of this is just, my love of American history and my study of American history, particularly that period of about 20, 25 years after World War II, where there was sort of a grand consensus in our politics. And it's not to say that there weren't problems then. Obviously they were. You had the horrible things going on in the South, and segregation and lynching and all of the terrible issues regarding essentially an apartheid state in the United States. But at the same time, the political parties weren't as dogmatic. In fact, at the time, you would have sort of liberal Republicans, people like Nelson Rockefeller. Hell, man, if you read the 1956 or 1960 Republican Party platform, the nominating platform, they were often trying to outmaneuver themselves on civil rights from the Democrats. And so that's something you don't see today. And one thing that's really troubling to me, and I think I was mentioning this with my previous guest, because I really like Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, is he makes a point of saying that if you know about one person's political position, chances are you can kind of fill in the gaps and figure out exactly what they believe on a bunch of other stuff, even if it's not related. So if you know what a person's position is on the estate tax, chances are you're probably going to know what their position is on climate change or abortion, when those don't have anything to do with one another. That's, I think, a real troubling sign in terms of how sort of homogenized our ideologies have become.
And it's completely unthinking. It'd be one thing if you happen to skeptically arrive at every position. Oh, these all happen to be on the right, or these all happen to be on the left. And I say this as someone who's self-described a very politically homeless liberal in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Because, there's issues that I do agree with that are typically traditional Republican positions. And I find the idea now if you happen to come to all of the left's positions skeptically, I can't fault you. That is what it is. But I don't think that's what's happening for the most part. I think a lot of people are just going with it because it makes you look good. You're part of the in crowd. It's its own kind of tribalism. Hey, if you believe all these things, we'll give you a super fancy label and you'll be one of the good ones. Okay. You'll be one of the in society who want to make things better. Don't think about it too hard. Even if the side is politically right, and generally I do agree with the political left in America, I don't think that's a very productive way of forming a political discourse or arriving at those positions. It's almost no better than being a climate change denier, because what's to stop you from being swayed on anything else that is factually incorrect?
Exactly. And I think actually, to sort of bring it all back home, I think that was in many ways what Pinker was trying to say in that clip, was this idea that if you don't really learn about some basic sort of facts about human nature and human societies, that and he described it as sort of being like, it's like a bacillus, that's sort of a bacteria that sort of clumps onto you and you don't have an immunity against it. And because you haven't really thought critically about it, you'll sort of glom on to whatever sort of extreme ideology it would be, whether it's something as sort of disgusting as the alt-right or something as I think problematic and non-productive as sort of the extreme left. So, to me, it's terrifying in the sense that, like, I feel the same way as you do. I'm sort of a center left guy, and I'm like you. I believe in a stronger defense. I'm not against capitalism. I am a very strong proponent of sort of a market capitalist system with regulation and social safety nets. It's, but at the same time, like I'm someone who firmly understands the problems regarding climate change, but at the same time actually support nuclear power, which a lot of people on the left don't. So it's, I find myself trying my best to sort of evaluate these things issue by issue and try to figure out where I'm at best, because sometimes I think being a part of a team is, for as sort of self-gratifying as it may feel, I think it often leaves you sort of in the lurch, because if someone comes to you with a really good argument against what you believe and you've never actually taken the time to think about it, then it's pretty easy to be bowled over.
Yes. And we see that happening all the time, obviously. And when push comes to shove, there is a practical use for political tribalism. So I don't want to act like it's all self-glorification necessarily. That is certainly it's a big element. But, every 4 years rolls around, I'm going to be voting for a Democrat. That's just how it goes, because on major issues that I have deemed important, I agree. And I can kind of, anything I don't like necessarily, I can shove aside. Even if it had been someone like Bernie Sanders who had been nominated, okay. I mean, it's not voting for Trump, so I will take it. We'll sort out the disagreements later. There's such a thing as a disagreement, and then there's such a thing as I won't even touch or debate this because it's not worth my time.
Exactly. And that goes back, I think, to sort of the nature of pragmatism that we were talking about earlier. So let's back up a little bit. And I'd like to hear about how you came to your atheism or your anti-theism.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not too dissimilar. See, the thing is, I feel like I tell this story a lot and I don't want to oversell it because I've talked to a lot of people who were in legitimately oppressive situations, who have histories with religion that dwarf mine by comparison. Because my upbringing was very typically American Protestant. It was traditional Christianity, non-denominational. For a good chunk of my life, I paid it very little mind. It was just something that was there, but ideas matter and ideologies sow seeds in people. There were a couple years where I took it upon myself to devote myself to the faith more. So I was a lot more fundamentalist and traditionalist in my views, conservative, you could even say, homophobic, all that. So I remember that pretty distinctly. It did come to a point, however, just as just a natural part of growing up, you start to question a lot of the authority figures in your life. You start wanting to do your own thing, and you start, taking a look at really the anchors in your life that are holding you down. Well, I want to do this, but I can't because of my religion. It gets to a point where God can't answer what I need him to answer. And that on top of myself coming into moral dilemmas with my faith. So that starts to sow some seeds of doubt, because that's how you start to question authority. Well, I was pretty heavily challenged by my peers regarding my homophobia. And it does make you think, well, I never really thought about it that way. I never really put myself in someone else's shoes. I never really had empathy. The more I think about this, I guess there really is nothing wrong. Why is that? Why is my religion like that? Why is a being that I am choosing to worship like that? And I have no answers. And I go to, I obviously can't go to God because he's not fucking real. So I go to people, like religious people in the religious community, those kinds of authority figures, actual humans who are real. And like, okay, can you explain this? Like, I don't understand. Of course, that's not a good conversation to have with those people. Basically, it's a very stock answer of like, oh, God works in mysterious ways. We don't question this. It's a God's will. It's above humanity. Maybe there was enough of a rebel spark in me to say, okay, fuck that. It's not good enough anymore. Like at that point, I'm a growing up, maturing person who wants to make their way in the world, who doesn't want to be so dependent on others. And I demand answers. I need a practical, reasonable answer for why this is the case, especially for something as extreme as saying, well, this is a sin. This is immoral in all cases. Something so seemingly innocuous. And then it's just kind of a domino effect from there. In terms of the anti-theism, that was just always there, really. It was more just like, okay, I have been religious. I've seen what this kind of cult-like thinking can do to people. I see the kinds of behavioral traits it can, install in people's minds. There was never, after leaving Christianity, there was nothing good to see in the church for me, really. I saw, all the quote unquote good as a means to an end. It was all rooted in brainwashing. And then when I started coming up against other religions like Islam, they just felt so similar to me. The fact that anyone was trying to act like, oh, this time it's totally different. This is a revamped Christianity 2.0. We got rid of all the nonsense. This is actually, it's a pro-women religion, guys. Come on. I'm like, maybe not. maybe we should reevaluate that, because I've heard this before. I've been to church. You're not going to trick me twice. I'm actually very perplexed by people who are not anti-theists and are atheists, because I have to wonder what version of religion they're seeing in the world. It's almost like they are completely accepting of mass human brainwashing and manipulation, extortion, bribery. These are things that I typically thought we agreed were bad. You have to explain to another thinking adult, like, no, actually, this system is fucked, and there's a lot to criticize here. To hear anyone come to the defense of that is the height of internet fedora edgelord contrarianism that really deserves no more of my time.
No, and I think that's fair. I mean, I think that on the whole, maybe one of the only arguments that would be compelling for why we should be softer, I guess, on religion or whatever, that some people would say, is sort of the pragmatic notion of, well, it's a huge public institution. Many, many people are connected to it. And what they would see as being the social benefits of it, it's okay to keep it around. What I would argue, in fact, is that I always liked what Christopher Hitchens said, which is that classic question of name a moral, ethical statement or action that can be done by a believer that can't be done by a non-believer. And to me, the answer is none. Anything that a believer can do for the betterment of humanity, a non-believer can do it. And the added benefit of a non-believer doing it is they do it because it's the right thing to do. They don't do it because they're sort of looking forward to heaven or hell. They're not doing it because they want to make sure their sky daddy is happy. They're not doing it because they're sort of institutionally benefited by doing it. They're doing it because it's right. And to me, that's always been way more moral. And
absolutely.
And to me, that's part of the reason why I think humanism is one of the ways you do that, and being outwardly, like openly, outwardly critical of religion. And at the same time saying, okay, yes, these systems are horrible and wrong and bad, and we need to criticize them as much as possible. But at the same time, we need to make a concerted effort to show why we the seculars, we the atheists, anti-theists, we the humanists, we're right, and that we are the ones who can build a better society that's not built on myth, that's not built on superstition, that's not built on wishful thinking, that's not built on weird blood cults, that's actually built on real human beings doing real things for one another. And that, because it frustrates me to no end the sort of apologetics people will get into, especially atheists, which is really bothersome to me, of people who constantly are sort of, they're sort of making excuses for bullshit. And I think it's really terrifying to me. It's something we've seen recently with the whole speculation of Oprah running for president. And I know, right? And I posted an article that Kurt Anderson wrote that is terrific, saying, like, this woman is she's a modern day P.T. Barnum. She is the biggest snake oil salesman of the late 20th, early 21st century. The amount of hucksters and liars and charlatans that she has propped up in the public is absolutely ridiculous. And the idea that she would make a good president because of it, simply by virtue that she's really good at speaking and hits all the right notes and seems like a nice person, that's bullshit. She's single-handedly responsible. In my opinion, Oprah Winfrey is not single-handedly, but one of the major reasons why we're having deaths of children in this country from vaccinated diseases, because people won't get vaccines, because she was a major proponent of giving Jenny McCarthy time on her fucking show. And the problem I have, this is one of the biggest problems I have with our culture, is that these people like Oprah, and Trump is even worse than this, is that these people can just do whatever the fuck they want to, and there's no social consequences for it, because there's always going to be a group of the country that will love them no matter what. And that's frustrating to no end.
No, there's the social reward, and it's a big part of we have a celebrity culture problem. I mean, that I think I've heard more celebrities announced for the 2020 run than actual politicians at this point.
That's really sad.
That is sad. It's just that's the state of American politics. And
you know who I really want to run in 2020? Someone who is really experienced and boring. We haven't had really experienced and boring in a very long time. The last president that we had who was both highly experienced and boring was George H.W. Bush. He was the last one. And he was really the last one. And and not to say that he was great. I'm just saying, like, this idea of we always, like, if you think about it, like Bill Clinton, young guy, governor, outsider, wins the White House. George W. Bush, sort of young guy, but I mean, kind of an outsider, but not really because his daddy's money. He gets in the White House. Then Obama, young guy, outsider, wins the White House. Trump, very old, very problematic, outsider, wins the White House. We just need somebody who's actually good at governing and who is not a complete and off piece of shit and who would actually be, I think, a reasonable choice. Hearing people say, oh yeah, I think Oprah would be great. Well, that was the problem we had in the first place. That kind of thinking is what got us Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of making jokes like, oh, the left, they're not going to be. Well, first off, they're not satisfied with corporatist shill Hillary Clinton. They can't. They hate experience. They hate people in Washington. And I was like, they're going to get their own version of Trump. And you're right, Oprah very much is that in a lot of ways. And I'm sure someone's going to clip that and be like, oh, false equivalence. Well, not really on the issues that we're comparing them here. And as a reflection of our celebrity-like culture, a culture that values this level of vapidness over political experience. Being president is not like, people treat it like it's nothing. And that's what gets to me. Being president is a fucking hard job that requires, like, it should require some previous political position of some sort, some kind of governance, some Senate seat, anything. I don't think you should be able to be an outsider in this, because we're putting the responsibility of an entire country, the world's like last superpower, in your hands. And if you're just some schmuck who happens to have money, oh, that's what we have now. And now we have to suffer the consequences for 4 years. So enjoy, America.
Seriously, it's terribly frustrating. But let's back up again just a little bit. You were talking earlier about how when you were sort of leaving your faith, you were talking about how some of the sort of moral questions that you had that were not being answered from religion. What were some of those, and why were they sort of instrumental in you leaving religion?
A big one, and I always try to hit on this because I think it's an important one, is the value of humanity. See, a lot of religious apologists, when they try to say, like, oh, atheism is no suitable path, you need religion because atheism can't answer these questions. And they'll pose some questions like, where did the universe come from? Where did human beings come from? What is our purpose here? That is a question, ironically, I don't think religion has been very successful at answering. Because as far as I can tell, religions, by and large, are very degrading to humans in general. We're not valued. We're cogs in a machine. So for anyone to kind of lift it up as a win, and granted, there's the other side where you'll have the Jews believe that they're God's chosen people, the Christians believe they're saved, yada, yada, yada. But by and large, I do find religion to be very dehumanizing. And that's a big question to get around, because if I value myself as a person, I can't be part of this. I can't be part of this in any way. That's a question that is going to come up, because I don't like the way religions exploit people. I don't like the way they treat people. And I would prefer not to be treated that way. I think that humanity can achieve a lot better than we have through religion. I think we already have in a lot of ways. You were saying like, oh, the humanists and the anti-theists, they need to set a better example. Atheist contributions to the world are astounding. What atheists have managed to do, even in the last 50 years, trumps a millennia of Christendom. It is amazing what we can accomplish. And there's roadblocks, there's obstacles, sure. And there's always going to be people arguing that, we can't have a culture without our religion. And even atheists will argue that our culture, the culture that is not religious, is consistently growing, and secularism is becoming more popular. It's just becoming the way things are in most of the Western world. Religion, they're hanging on, and they're kind of thrashing around because I think they know that their time is up for a lot of these people. They had some real nice laurels to rest on for a while. And that's why they're in such a frenzied panic about retaining that power, because they're losing. Like their loss is inevitable at this point.
I think it's a big part of the reason that Trump won. I mean, I've mentioned this many times on the podcast that 81% of evangelicals voted for Trump in the 2016 election. That's just for context, that's 2% higher than evangelicals voted for George W. Bush in the 2004 reelect, which was the God, Guns, and Gays election. So it's one of those things where, to me, it's this sort of unholy or very, very holy alliance between sort of evangelicals and Trump. I did want to back up and sort of clarify what I was saying earlier. I totally agree with you about the achievements of free thinkers. I mean, as somebody, in my business in doing history, I wrote my master's thesis on Robert Ingersoll, the late great 19th century free thought orator. And he was an amazing, amazing man. I mean, he lived in the late 19th century, and he gave very public speeches about the failures of Christianity, the errors of the Bible, and sort of defending a very pro-human, anti-religious worldview, and would get thousands of people to show up for his lectures because he was that popular and people loved him. And then in terms of the 20th century, I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, you and I wouldn't be sitting here without people like Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who I think in many ways was such a pioneer and really helped, in my estimation, really helped atheism become a part of the broader culture through her appearances on Donahue and things like that. And then, of course, with the modern era we're living in now, I mean, it's really great. I mean, you have a wide variety of different perspectives and views, and it's growing by the day. And I think it's absolutely terrific. And so I totally agree with you that we as atheists or anti-theists or skeptical or secular people, we have always been sort of the vanguard of progress. We've always been the vanguard of the future. We've always been the people who stand firmly at sort of the precipice of nonsense and tell it no. And that's, that is the Enlightenment tradition. That's the Renaissance tradition. And to me, the world is always progressed by people who do not accept the way things are and decide to be different. So I think that's worthwhile for sure. Yeah,
I definitely agree. And we've always been here. That's the other thing that bothers me. People act like this is a new phenomenon. No, it's just that more people are speaking out now.
Absolutely.
And that's the process of normalization. I love that there are so many, like, I know a lot of people complain about the saturation of atheist channels or whatever. I think it's great.
Me too.
I mean, this is a sign like, hey, look, these people, they felt inspired. And there are still very much religious issues in my society. They are dying, but they exist. And Trump is a good example.
Totally. Or the vast amount of abortion restrictions since 2011 at the state and local level.
And it's almost completely religiously justified. On the Trump thing, what's funny to me, like a sign that it is a frenzied panic about, we need to preserve our culture, we need to preserve our religion and our way of life. Trump isn't exactly what I would call a Christian icon. First off, I don't think he is. I don't think he's a Christian. He's certainly not a practicing Christian. He is a blatantly chauvinistic, immoral person who you're not bringing him for like a Sunday school presentation. So the fact that this was the guy, like they were willing to throw away all principle. Fuck it. Give us anyone who even parrots the barest minimum talking points. And that was very revealing of not even of Trump. I mean, Trump's an opportunist, but he's smart. It's more revealing of the Pat Robertson crowd. Like, okay, now I know where your head's at. Now I know what's important to you, because you're not, they act so self-righteous when really they're just as greedy and opportunist as anyone else. And I knew that, but I like seeing that exposed on a public level.
Oh, me too. I mean, one thing that I've talked a lot about is this idea that I think part of the reason that they went with Trump was, and I didn't honestly, like, there was a part of me that was like, I can't be this cynical. But no, I'm right. Which is this idea that they are so committed to a sort of real politic that I didn't think they were. And that blew my mind. I thought, well, I think they'll probably have enough principle to say no, but they don't, because their thinking the subject was, if he gets in the White House, we'll get a Scalia replacement. We will get the Johnson Amendment repealed. We will get possibly new federal abortion restrictions. We will get more conservative, evangelical, or super religious people on federal judgeships. They were playing the long haul in a way that the left doesn't always do, which is really interesting to me, that the left doesn't care as much about the courts as the right does, which is always strange to me, because you would think the left would care about the courts more, because a lot of the sort of major pieces of social legislation or social change often happen through the courts. So you'd think that they would have a more concerted effort to sort of work on that. And in some ways, I think they are. But the right are so damn good at it. And the evangelicals' sort of alliance with Trump, to me, is such an example of sort of just balance of power. It's almost like Kissingerian in a way.
Leading up to the most recent presidential election, what we knew was Antonin Scalia had passed away. So there's one seat right there. And as morbid as it is to talk about, there's some old birds on SCOTUS. I mean, they're not lasting long. Potentially Trump could get a few more. Horrifying. This alone, I mean, just one seat alone, the fact that people stayed home for the election, people who, I want to be nice, but I can't. People who say that they're left leaning, they stayed home, or they voted Jill Stein, or they were Bernie or bust. Fuck those people. You're no leftist in my mind. You're no comrade in arms for me, bud. Because if the shoe had been on the other foot, I would have come out and voted for your candidate, despite my disagreements.
Oh, exactly. I mean, the moment that Scalia died was the sheer fact that he died when he did in such a contentious election. That was really the moment where I was, because I did vote for Bernie Sanders in the primary, and I didn't always agree with him. I thought he was a little wimpy on foreign policy, which it turns out he was, and sort of, I think, quite ill-informed on foreign policy, which was, I think, really a problematic notion. But when it came down to it, I mean, once Scalia died in the court, I was like, no, hold on. There is no equivocate, like, there's no waffling around here. Like Hillary Clinton, despite all of her flaws, needs to win this election, because if she doesn't, then we're going to have a conservative Supreme Court for a generation. And that's a terrifying notion, because there's a legitimate shot that within a decade, I mean, think of that, the cake case at the Supreme Court now. I mean, this is something that, had, Obama actually gotten his nominee, Merrick Garland, or if Hillary Clinton had won, we wouldn't have to really worry about as much. And so, again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier at the start of the show, where we're talking about the sort of nature of pragmatism and compromise, and sort of, working with what you have when you have it. And there's really no, in this contentious space we're living in now, there's really no space to sort of sit high and mighty.
No, it changes too frequently. People overestimate Sanders, people underestimate Trump. People treated Trump like a joke. I mean, he is a joke as a person, but as a political candidate, he had a strong base. Mm-hmm. He was there to win, and he was there to change the political scenery, and he did that. I hope that going forward, they don't fucking run Oprah. They actually run somebody who's going to put up a good fight. Or you know what? Don't listen to me. Run Oprah. Just let it be a giant joke, because apparently what my country is now. Right.
I mean, it's at least when when the cities burn down, we'll be warm. But I mean, so Let's talk a little bit more about sort of the emergence of, so you have, Reece, the former Christian, now anti-theist. Now we get into, YouTube commentator with Nightmare Fuel. And I'd love to know sort of the genesis of Nightmare Fuel. I'd love to know how the channel really began, what you were interested in talking about. And I guess as a sort of interesting notion, I love sort of logos and icons and avatars and symbols. I'd love to know where the skull comes from and sort of why you chose that as your symbol.
I wish there was a fascinating story behind it all, because a lot of these things, they do end up just happening. I'd been kind of dabbling in making YouTube videos for a while, just under different names that are not even that important. And, they were very different kinds of videos. They were just kind of mostly vlogs, just kind of giving my opinion about things, about politics, about Fox News, whatever. And it came to the point where I wanted to, I did become more involved with an anti-SJW community. I saw what a lot of people were doing. I thought, hey, that's cool. Maybe I'll take a stab at it, see if I'm any good. I like the avatar thing. I think it's good branding. The name Nightmare Fuel was just kind of a phrase that I like to use. I just find it phonically pleasing for whatever reason. So I was like, hey, that's a cool name. I'll go with that. And in terms of the skull, I kind of just put out a call like, hey, I'm looking for an avatar. At the time I was using an avatar. It was H.P. Lovecraft wearing Thug Life shades. So it was very different. But I put out this call. I'm like, hey, this is, I kind of want, like, I guess, a nightmarish avatar. And I was sent the idea of a skeleton in a suit. It wasn't it's not the original one you're seeing now. This is the third iteration. So I was kind of like, I sent that, I liked it. People did all kinds of fan arts, sent them in. And at first it really was just fucking around with this new format. Like, okay, I'll review videos, or I'll give my thoughts on this, and I'll have an avatar, and it'll just mostly be voiceover. It's certainly a more convenient way to make videos as opposed to, having to have all this equipment or whatever. And I can see why a lot of people do it for that reason. And I got into it, and I just kind of wanted to touch on various things. At first, what's funny is at first, under this moniker and using this avatar, it was primarily anti-SJW content, which I think would surprise a lot of people given how far left I lean. It was just, it was a phase. It was a phase, man. And I still definitely talk about it. But, that was something that particularly interested me at the time. And there were a lot of things that I wanted to touch on. Race topics. That was something that always pissed me off about the community, because very, very few of them would touch issues that had anything to do with race. I can see why they're worried. But, for a community that prides itself on being so trigger happy, it's a little weak. There's an overemphasis on radical feminism, which is the definition of a dead issue. We very much have very real racial tensions in the country that I thought were worth addressing, or at least addressing some of the narratives that form around that. And I did that for a while. I started getting into feuds. It didn't take long before I started getting into feuds with other atheists. Basically, so pretty much right off the bat, what's funny is, like, the first atheists I really fought with were pro-Islam atheists.
Oh,
so we had a big drag out fight, and a lot of them were Atheist Republic contributors, and it was nasty. Insults were traded. I had many a thing to say.
I know there was one guy, and I can't remember who he is, but I remember there's one dude who you always sort of criticized in some of your videos, who used to host the Atheist Republic podcast, who looked like such a fucking moron. And I can't remember the dude's name, but he was such a dipshit. And I was like, I'm so glad that, like, somebody's exposing this guy, because he just looks like a fucking moron.
Yeah, that is Casper Rigsby.
Oh yeah,
who I happened to I came across him almost entirely by accident, and I was like, I'd obviously heard of Atheist Republic because they have like the most popular Facebook. And what's funny now is the team behind Atheist Republic were totally cool. Like that's the grand irony. Like they retweet my videos all the time. It's fucking hilarious.
Well, Armin and I are Facebook friends, and I've spoken with a little bit. I don't know if he's directly associated with Atheist Republic, but I've talked with Ali Rizvi too. So I mean, there's definitely, and I belong to the Facebook group, and I share shit in there. So, but it's
sure,
but
none of it's too personal. But
no,
a lot of it is YouTube fun and
of
banter.
course.
But I was just kind of like, I part of me was thinking, this is Atheist Republic. Like this is their representation on YouTube. Like I'm hearing some really dumb shit here, and I can't believe I'm the only one saying anything. But that was fun, and that went on for a while, and I tried to vary up the content that way, just kind of further establishing myself as that guy, that asshole atheist who's just he's not even nice to the other atheists. And it got around, I would say, like late 2016. I had obviously made some anti-conservative, anti-libertarian videos because that's just what I do. But I didn't start to ramp it up because I started to see that as just kind of a rising trend. And I was like, okay, what? I thought this was a dead issue too. Do I really need to talk about this? I was kind of over criticizing Mike Pence and all that, but I made a video about him. I made videos about Lauren Southern and Dave Rubin, and those caught on, and those definitely attracted a new audience and ushered in a new era of the channel. I would say that I've even moved on in a lot of ways from that, though, because I kind of had my demonstration of liberalism. Like, hey guys, I'm against this feminism nonsense just as much as you, but like let's get some ground rules straight. And I think we've moved into a phase where I have, for whatever reason, controversial issues regarding religion, foreign policy, anything like that. And I appreciate having a channel that is my own space where I can just talk about whatever, where I can talk about things that no one else is talking about, because that's kind of boring. Yeah. And that's why I try not to get too involved with the community at this point, because it's very stagnant, unfortunately. But I would say that is kind of the era we've moved into. And unfortunately that pissed a lot of the liberals off because, hey, look, man, I liked your video criticizing Dave Rubin, the most low-hanging fruit in the universe. But you're about foreign policy, just you sound like a neocon, and also, why are you such an asshole to Christians? They didn't do nothing. Basically, I cannot tell you how many comments I have received where that is probably verbatim. Oh, I bet. But I've been talking. I'll let you go. No, please. So I do want to come back to talking. I know you've done it at length, but if you'd be so kind, I do want to spend a couple minutes on Rubin, because that's how I discovered. That's sure. How I just. It'll actually be fun now. Okay, because that's how I discovered your content. So I was a fan of Rubin's. I started watching him way even back in 2015 when he first had Sam Harris on, and he had Cara Santa Maria, he had Dave Silverman. I was like, okay, this guy's got some pretty solid atheist cred. He seems like a pretty decent guy, pretty cool, interesting commentator. I always thought he was kind of a bit simple. Yes. I always thought that. I always thought, well, this guy's just kind of a basic insert random white guy, or, standard generic white dude here. But I always liked the fact that he would sort of get out of his guest's way and sort of have these better conversations. He was like, he reminded me a lot of like Charlie Rose or somebody like Larry King, somebody like that. And really like very clearly modeling himself after Larry King. Yes, for sure. I mean, when he had Larry King on, I think at one point it was like a love fest, because he was like on Larry King's channel or whatever. And then he started hosting people who were really weird and kind of crazy to me. So people like Vilo and people like, weird Mike Cernovich and people like those types. And then I'm like, and I noticed that like the atheists guests started to become less and less, and sort of the rabid right-wingers and weird people from the internet became more and more. And especially after he went independent, it got really, really worse.
And I guess my biggest problem with Dave, and this is part of why I stopped watching the show, and even though I know Michael Shermer was on it recently, and I was like almost tempted, because I like Michael Shermer, I was almost tempted to watch it. But I was like, nope, got to stay with my principles, which is that my problem with Dave Rubin is he's fundamentally duplicitous about what he does.
Yes.
He constantly says, I'm a liberal, I am this, I am that, I'm with you. But then holds basically your standard sort of boilerplate right-wing politics. But anytime you call him that, he gets his panties in a bunch and just flips his shit anytime you call him somebody on the right. And I remember because he always constantly says, well, I'm gay married and I believe in marijuana legalization and I'm for this and I'm for that. Although he doesn't say he's for single payer anymore. And I imagine that's because he wants Ben Shapiro to write the foreword to his book. But it's this fundamental sort of, like I said, duplicity where he says he's one thing when in reality he's another. And the fact that he is virtually incapable of criticizing Donald Trump, which drives me nuts. If you're somebody who's a libertarian, if you think of yourself as a libertarian, you should be critical of Donald Trump. You should be critical of the fact that he has this much power in the executive branch. You should be critical of the fact that he wants to sort of, he wants to curtail the liberties of the press. And I always found it convenient that any time that Dave, and I think maybe even you said this on one of your videos, it's always convenient that any time Donald Trump fucks up royally, Dave goes off the grid. And he grows out his beard like
he does,
like the Messiah figure that he is, and it just
like
makes
Luke Skywalker.
Well, he thinks he is the last real liberal. So, but it's this, and it's such a bullshit. And I know Michael Brooks made this point too, which it's such a bullshit argument to say that Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy would be Republicans today. No, they wouldn't.
No.
I mean, they wouldn't at all. I mean, Martin Luther King would be a speaker at a Bernie Sanders rally, and John F. Kennedy would be a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. It's like, it's this idea that somehow, oh, they're the real liberals. It's like, I just don't, I think it's a mix of him just genuinely being stupid enough to not really know what his actual beliefs are, which I think is a part of it, or just fundamentally being dishonest. So that's kind of like my problem with it. And then I discovered your videos and I went, thank goodness somebody's saying this. Because I was so worried that this side of our movement where, Dave was sort of held up as like this fucking champion of awesomeness was really troubling to me. Because I was just like, this dude is willing to do anything and to be anybody for money. And I was really bothered by that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I obviously agree with all that. I'm actually going to do a first though. And I'll do it for your podcast. Thank you. Going before I get into my negativity, which is easy regarding Rubin. I'll take a moment to defend him actually, which is a first, I think. But I think Rubin in a lot of ways is a victim of circumstance. I think Rubin, he obviously he was on the Young Turks. He was ultra progressive. And he started to fall away from that. And we know the reason why he fell away, because of the Young Turks feud with Sam Harris. And he saw videos about that. He watched the interview Cenk did with Harris. And there's obviously issues to take with how the progressives handled someone who really is a distinguished guest, someone who should not be treated like that, someone who should not be smeared like that. That is obviously not good. So Rubin fell away from that. He went, off to do his own show on his own channel. And at first he's getting Sam Harris. Okay, there's a good guess. And a lot of very opportunistic parasites jumped on board as well, though. They saw that this is the platform to use, because at that point, Rubin is a known person. I mean, how could you not be? You're a Young Turks mutineer, practically. You're the dissenter. Like, you stood up to Cenk, and just for that, in some people's eyes, you're Jesus. People were biting at the bit to be on that show. Not all of them with the best of intentions. They obviously all want to spread their various political ideologies, And not everyone, obviously, this kind of goes without saying, not everyone who has issues with progressive politics has the best political message to spread. So you're going to get your Milos and your Mike Cernoviches or whoever. My issue is not him having these people, because I think that these people, you could have a good interview with anyone. And you could have a good interview with Milo. Milo's an interesting guy. And someone who I've given props to and defended in the past when I thought it was necessary, even though I'm not a big fan. But it's Ruben is just such a pushover, is what really gets me. This is a man, it's funny to hear him lecture others. So I'm going to end the complimentary segment there.
Which, by the way, with the complimentary section that you give, I totally agree with you. I love you describing him as a victim of circumstance, because I think that's exactly right. So go ahead.
He is. But he is a pushover. It's ironic that he would lecture anyone on principle and like I'm the true whatever liberal libertarian. Who even knows liberalists? That's the new thing.
Oh Jesus.
This is a guy who would sell out any one of his beliefs for any controversial guest. This is a guy who will just sit there, nod along to whatever anyone has to say. Trump does something shitty, this kind of harkens back to some of the first videos I made about Dave Rubin. He's talking about Trump like, oh, that was 4D chess. Oh, that was a brilliant troll move. What? That's your criticism? Okay, I know where you're coming from now. Propagandist horror.
Yeah.
Seriously, it was... And I think he's dialed back, honestly. Like, that might be another surprising thing. Like, when Trump was, like, first getting into office before we really knew what he would be, he was very much more defensive. He was making videos about it all the time. That was the worst. He's still doing it to a certain extent, but I think part of him knows, like, ooh, I can't take that apologia too far because I'm obviously full of shit and he's not a good president. So I'm walking on thin ice here. I think he's self-aware enough to know.
I think that's true. I mean, he rides a very, very, very curious tightrope. He made a video a while back, I think, called like Dave Rubin's audience is filled with Christian lunatics or something like that. And you made a really good point, which is that like Dave sort of sold out his atheism for that Patreon money, which I get it. If your audience is primarily religious and primarily conservative, if you constantly sort of bitch about religion, you're going to lose their money. And I found there was one particular moment, I think you highlighted either in this video or another one, where he was doing a Q&A and somebody asked him about his atheism, and he gave this most milquetoast bullshit answer about, well, you know, I'm just changing a lot lately and I don't know. And I'm asking a lot of questions. And, you know, I mean, dude, your lips are so white from kissing so much of Dennis Prager's ass. I mean, I mean, just own it. That's my biggest problem with him is he will never just fucking own it. You know, like if he just came out and said, look, I'm a right-wing guy and I have a right-wing show, I would be cool with that. Like, that is admirable. But he doesn't, and that's what makes me mad. Is it's that constant sort of, oh, I'm the last liberal. I'm defending liberal bullshit. You are a right wing guy, and you have a right wing show. No shame in that. No harm in that. Just fucking own it.
His way of getting around that was saying, defending my liberal principles has become a conservative position.
But why has it? I mean, see, that's my whole thing is it's like, I'm a liberal and I'm defending my liberal positions as a liberal. Like, I'm not doing it as a conservative, nor do I have to. You know, like that's such a bullshit answer to me, because here's the whole thing. Like, you don't have to switch to the nutcase right in order to fix the left. You can stay in the left and be sort of an iconoclast of the left and fix it from the inside. Like that just makes
be like
sense.
Me, Ruben. Come on.
Exactly. You know, it's crazy to me. But my problem is, because I did a podcast a while back when I really lost it. I mean, I kind of was like, I ranted about Ruben, and I was like, I just genuinely think he's not smart enough to truly understand the implications of what he's doing. And not all the time. I think some of the time he does, but not all of the time. And so he reminds me very much of like somebody pissing in the wind. It's just, it's sort of flying all over the place, and it's going to go where it's going to go. And wherever it's going to go, it's going to go. But there's no aim to it.
Yeah. I could make a lot of jokes about, I mean, he's obviously a simpleton.
Have you ever seen him try to do stand up? It's fucking painful.
Oh yeah. I'm well aware of those gems that have been unearthed. But with Ruben, it's more, I don't feel like he's dumb necessarily. I feel like he's extremely socially disconnected. And maybe that's in part to going off the grid so much, but that's might be part of it.
Could you elaborate on that? What do you mean by that? Like socially, like he's in such a bubble.
He is in a bubble. I mean, he blocks a lot of people, but like just the way he'll talk about issues, like he'll talk about the way he talks about social justice warriors. You would think he was talking about like a platoon of stormtroopers.
I know,
marching down Washington Avenue.
Like they're the fucking Stasi.
It's so, and like, don't get me wrong, and this is coming from me, so this should really mean a lot. I am one of the most anti-SJU people you're gonna find. Like I have no time for them. I have no time for a lot of progressive politics. But I hear Ruben talking about it, and I'm just like, what kind of fantasy world do you live in? Like, really, like this is not, like, these are not the important issues of today. And you are selling us out for worst political candidates who he endorses all the time.
Yeah. Like
he endorsed some guy, what was it? Austin
Oh
Peterson.
my God. Pro-life. Yeah. What a nutcase. He's an atheist who's pro-life. Who'd thunk?
Yeah, well, there had to be one.
Right.
That reminds me, getting back to his atheism thing.
Yeah.
I was actually very pleased to see a good chunk of the atheist community did make videos about that. It wasn't just me, because it just gets to a point of absurdity. Like you hear this guy and you're just like, what have you been smoking? Like where have you been to question yourself? Like these are obvious issues. And of course he's kind of touting some, like, oh, because he's Ruben, he's not going to say, like, if he can't say he's a conservative, he's not going to say he's a Christian either.
No.
He says, I'm an agnostic, which is the most bullshit non-answer in human history.
Exactly.
I don't even respect it as an answer. I hear people like, I'm an agnostic. Okay, that's actually answer the question, maybe. Like, that doesn't count.
Well, and with Ruben, to me, it seems like part of that reminds me very much. So I used to work at a bookstore, and I worked at a bookstore at the peak of Twilight Mania. And one thing I remember a friend telling me, because I had never read them, I didn't know why they were so popular. And someone said to me, the reason that they're so popular among, is the fact that the character of Bella, the girl character in the book, the one who's the romantic lead, she is described in the book in such a vague and open way that the reader can sort of glom onto the character whatever they want. I think Dave Rubin is the Bella of politics.
Putting on a shirt.
Or as Dick Coughlin says, in the War of Ideas, Dave Rubin is Grenada. But yeah, what I mean by that is that he keeps himself so purposefully vague and sort of without any sort of real clear ideas besides being against SJWs or whatever, so that sort of his listeners can sort of glom onto them whatever they want. And I did that for a really long time. I speak from experience. I thought of him as being somebody he really wasn't. And then at some point it was like Wizard of Oz. Sort of the curtain was pulled, and I saw the man, and I was like, oh, I get this now. I get what he's doing. I think some of it is just clear opportunism. I mean, the dude makes like what? I mean, you did a tweet recently. He makes nearly $30,000 a month on Instagram, or not Instagram, but Patron.
In a month.
That's nuts. That's nuts. I mean, Jordan Peterson makes way more. I mean,
he makes like 60,000.
Wouldn't you want to have a great job where you could, be critical of laws about trans people and then putting words into a random sentence generator and make that much money? I mean, it's because that's what Jordan Peterson does. I mean, trying to hear him talk is one of the hardest things I can do.
I have described him as awkward and painful to listen to. I very much agree.
So we've done enough bashing of Ruben. So let's
I don't think I have.
I love it. I love it because my problem with him is and is just this idea of just he says he's one thing and he's not, and then sort of doesn't own what he is. That makes me really angry because in the culture that means that you don't have the balls to actually just say what you are, and that
it is duplicitous.
And it is duplicitous, and I think it's, quite frankly, and I don't mean to be flippant when I say this, I think it's a little problematic and dangerous to our culture of we have this guy who is really willing to talk to pretty much anybody, which I think is cool and admirable, but he just sort of sits there and let them say whatever the fuck they want. He never actually has a conversation with them. It's pretty much just like a monologue with some guy shooting him questions. You could almost replace him with a robot.
And because it's Dave Rubin's audience, and he is, I mean, he's not just some stock interviewer. He's recognized in the community as, oh, this is someone who we like. This is someone who we respect. He does validate a lot of people. Mm-hmm. He does validate a lot of political positions. And I think what you were just saying actually moves beautifully into some of the main criticisms I've received going after Rubin. People will say, oh, he's, they'll comment on the blandness and be like, oh, but he's so nice and harmless. How could you take issue with this guy? I think we've thoroughly explained why. And he's very obviously, this is someone with an agenda. I think a lot of people are also weirded out. It's because Ruben's a weird person to focus on because he's an interviewer. He's never the main focus of most of his videos. It's always Milo or whoever. But I think that criticizing Ruben is an exercise in exposing the man behind the curtain in that sense. Expose who's pulling the strings. It's a great way to learn how propaganda works. Mm-hmm. What Ruben chooses to cover, who Ruben chooses to have on, is a reflection of his channel and of the message that he wants to send to people. And mostly, let's keep in mind, a lot of young people. Like when I think of what Ruben's audience must be, we're talking a lot of teenagers, people who are very politically confused. People who might say, oh, this, being liberal is good. Being liberal has this positive social stigma attached to it. Is this what being a liberal means? That's why that's dangerous. It goes beyond Dave Rubin just being a pussy, and it turns into, you are corrupting the minds of potentially promising people with your garbage. So I think that you are absolutely free to call out and criticize, and for a guy and for a community that he's built around him that bitch about outrage culture, you would be amazed at how outraged his fans have been at a lot of my videos. Like, how dare you call out the fucking golden fleece that is Dave Rubin,
right?
He's on this pedestal that just needs to be protected at all times. Like he's a fucking god. No, he's just a guy with an opinion. I see YouTube videos made about anyone far more vicious than the ones I've made about Dave Rubin, and those are okay. We can publicly attack those people, but Dave Rubin, no. He's with us. He's one of the good ones. We don't do that, and that weirds a lot of people out. I think that was a draw for a lot of people too. People who lean farther left than me, even they had an image of their head of what the skeptic community was, what an anti-SJW YouTuber was. And I wanted to challenge that stereotype in some way. Like say, hey, we're not all the same. Look, I can't stand this guy either. Let's be real. And I was never a big fan, I should say. But there was a point when I wasn't as down on him. And then I started to see more, and I'm like, I think I was in the same boat as you. Like, oh my God, what is this guy doing? This guy's respected. He's getting a lot of views, and he's getting a lot of likes and not much dislike here. He's not getting a lot of flack for what he's saying. He is very influential on the discourse in this community, and just in the political YouTube community in general. The idea that he is off limits to criticize is absurd.
I completely agree. And to sort of change gears, one thing I did want to come back to is your criticism of the social justice warrior culture, because in the past I have been critical of it as well. Now, I will say this, I mean, in full disclosure, I mean, there's a lot about the social justice movement that I do identify with, stuff that I think is important, stuff that I think is valuable. What my criticisms are generally are mostly tactical ones, where it's about, I don't necessarily agree with you on some of the principles, although we can hash that out. But mainly it's about the way in with which you sort of try to go about those things. So it's whether it's the sort of the uppity kids on college campuses who, you know, throw a fit or whatever, or it's what happened to Brett Weinstein at Evergreen, or what happened to Charles Murray at Middlebury. You know, these are things I think are serious problems. And when some people in the community sort of describe it as being not as much of an issue, I do think is an issue, because I think that colleges and universities are supposed to be places of an open discourse of ideas. And that's not to say that we can't have serious discussions about who we want on campus and things like that. But I think it's just a strategic misfire from I think young, mostly well-intentioned people who, you know, make decisions or take actions that I think are problematic. On the other side of it, though, I do think there is a very conscious sort of political sphere that is, to me, just as toxic as somebody like Ruben. Like, I really can't fucking stand Steve Shives. Steve strikes me as being, it's really, the word I use to think about him the most is shrill. He's very shrill. And he did that video on the Sandusky stuff and just lost his fucking mind. And just watching a man lose his sense of composure over a 6-minute video was very interesting to me. And so I don't really like him. I cannot stand PC Myers. I can't stand a lot of those folks. So give me sort of your breakdown of why you got into the sort of anti-SJW space, your issues with the social justice warrior people, or your issues with social justice in general.
A lot of it is ironically a mirror of the Christian thing. I would never consider myself progressive to the point at any point in my life as being an SJW, although I definitely had my leanings and my tendencies. But I came out of that. I wanted to moderate my politics. I wanted to be more responsible. I wanted to be more receptive to other points of view. These are things that are very contrary to this movement. I think that some people oversell it, like Dave Rubin, we were just talking about. And I think some people undersell it. I think a lot of people place focus on the college campus setting and the students. I think that these ideas go far beyond that in their effect on the population, and notably the adult population. These are major issues, and these are major political disagreements between me and people on the left. I think the left, in a lot of ways, as much as I politically agree with them, there is a lot of open anti-Semitism. There's a lot of open anti-white rhetoric, anti-white American rhetoric that is toxic and I don't want around me. People used to think that SJWs, like, they're just these kids that freak out or they spurg out at school. It was kind of a joke. Like, I think the whole thing kind of started out as a joke, like, let's make fun of these people. And for me, in a lot of ways, I mean, by all means, make fun of those people. They're very entitled brats. I mean,
you got the girl with the red hair, you got Trigglypuff, there are definitely ones that are like, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. I mean, it's so easy to.
They're not, those people are not even worth making videos about to me at this point.
No.
But I mean, maybe just for like a shit post, but
yeah, exactly.
I think that there are far more pressing issues in terms of effects on culture. And I don't want these people to win. I don't want these people to win elections. Now, I will vote for them when push comes to shove, but a purist point of view, for briefly, I just don't agree. I don't agree. I think that a lot of the problems that someone like Shives would try to artificially stretch on the women's suffrage movement with is just time-wasting nonsense. And ironically, like they'll sell them as the most important issues facing society today. They ironically take away precious time from actual issues that need to be discussed. Now, some people take it upon themselves to rake Steve Shives across the coals every week. I don't have such patience.
That's too much work.
It is far too much work because at the end of the day, I think Steve Shives is a time waster, which I think is very apropos because that is an insult that he uses against people. So I am going to use it against him. Steve Shives is the definition of a time waster.
Yeah, I always feel like with there's always that 5 to 10 minutes I'm never going to get back.
Oh, every minute wasted. And I say this as someone who has made videos against Shives. Just, I'll vary it up. I'll go after Shives. But, that's if something particularly interested me. And there's a lot of issues that I will just kind of publicly comment on, not even looking to piss people off necessarily. I'm just a public figure who has things to say. Apparently, some people care and listen. And it will piss off a good segment of the left. They obviously don't like what I have to say about foreign policy. They don't like what I have to say about the police departments in America. They don't like what I have to say about various cases involving police officers. They don't like what I have to say about any of that. They certainly don't like when I agree in quotes with the alt-right. And it's that kind of public flogging that I've received from what I have to say is a majority of leftists in my circle that really is the turning point for me. It's a moment where I have to take a step back, consider like what do I politically value? Mm-hmm. What is it with these people? Why are they such douchebags to me? I don't understand. Granted, I can be a bit incendiary, but I really don't mean to be all the time. I do want to talk about issues and offer a different perspective. I've had issues there. You're not even going to remember this. It was such a minor issue. I believe it was after the Philando Castile verdict came out. There were protests outside the courthouse. People were sending me videos of the riot police, quote unquote, engaging in brutality, which basically a rock was thrown at one of their heads and they pepper sprayed a guy in the face. And that was the definition of police brutality. And I received clips of this. People send me clips like this, like they are the ultimate gotcha. Like, haha, I've shown you the pigs are shit. What? And then I'll go to obviously defend the police officer who is just some innocent person doing their job. And it was just previously attacked. And then, oh my God, you're such a bootlicker cop shill. Okay. I see how it is. Why do I even bother sometimes? I will never know.
I think it's so interesting. So I have some of the similar problems, but actually most of them have to do with capitalism. So I'm interested. Yeah,
me too.
So for me, I'm a pretty open capitalist. What I believe in is sort of a social democratic kind of capitalism where you have a market that's free and robust and innovative and international, but with strong regulations and a social safety net. It doesn't sound very controversial on the face, but that's very controversial to people for some reason.
There has been somewhat of a push for communism. And that's alarming. I mean, in America, in a country with this much of a red scare, it's amazing how many communists I talk to.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me because, I do listen to commentators who I do like, who are to the left of me, who sort of describe themselves as being anti-capitalist. And I'm not. I mean, the thing about it that I try to explain to people is capitalism creates wealth. That's what it does, right? Socialism doesn't create wealth. It moves wealth around. And there's nothing just like wrong with that, but that's what it does. Capitalism is the mechanism by which we can sort of create wealth because it has the dynamism, the entrepreneurship, the innovation, the trade, the voluntarism that can sort of create the sort of bottom up and not top down processes that people can have to make meaningful growth of an economy and of a population. And the thing to me is that comes out of my years of being a libertarian. I was a very public libertarian for many, many years. I was an objectivist for many years, a follower of Ayn Rand. And some of that still sticks with me. I still think that markets work. And when markets don't work, we need government. And for those who are left at the bottom because of the dynamics of capitalism, we need to have a social safety net for them too. Because we're all subject. We could all end up being completely and totally disadvantaged at one point in their life or another. So, but that's the thing, the other part of it is I'm also not as, I'm worried about climate change. I'm not as worried about it. And I don't do a lot of the doomsday saying that a lot of people on the left do. Part of that is I think that my hope is that because Steven Pinker's newest book that's actually coming out, Enlightenment Now, he talks about how global CO2 emissions have actually declined over the last 50 years or so. And I think one of the ways that we combat climate change actually is with economics. I think it actually is with capitalism. It's with sort of regulated capitalism, where we have strong environmental laws and protections that both sort of incentivize markets to be more efficient and less energy wasteful, and at the same time lower emissions. I think that when people like Bill McKibben say like we need to cut CO2 emissions by 80%, I'm like, I understand that's probably a noble and lofty goal to have, but it's unrealistic. You have billions of people around the world who are now sort of being plugged into the global marketplace, whether they be in Asia or they be in Southeast Asia or China or India. These people are literally billions of people, and in Africa as well, billions of people who are coming onto the global marketplace. They're going to need energy. And unless you can figure out a way to make that be with solar panels and with wind turbines, unless you can figure out a way to do that on a global scale, it's going to be fossil fuels. So, or don't be so against nuclear energy. And this is where I have my disagreements with the left. It's mainly just the fact that they sort of want this, like, I don't know, how do you describe it, this sort of uber socialist utopia that they think is just going to solve everything. And I don't think that's the case.
Well, that's that gets back to the partisanship we were talking about, and just kind of a devotion to political narratives on your side and your side alone. I find it ironic that a lot of these champagne socialists with their lofty goals, like, oh, we're going to pay for college or whatever, don't see the benefit of capitalism, because you're not going to be generating much wealth to pay for anything under they throw these words around, like, I understand, like, and I'm not an extremely pro capitalism person in any traditional sense. I'm very critical of a lot of the free market whatevers. So
me too, especially in regards to, for me too. I mean, especially in regards to inequality. I totally agree with you on that.
Yes, it's a major issue, and it's arguably the biggest domestic issue we face. Mm-hmm. So I hope that coming from me, this means something to those people further left than me. But they throw communism around, or they'll throw down with capitalism around. I don't think they understand the full implications of that. Like, I don't think they understand the level of authoritarianism it would require to outlaw capitalism. Not a society that I'm looking to join anytime soon. And they'll always go on like, oh, communism, it's never really been tried before. Those were failed attempts. Those don't count. So ignore the millions of corpses. Those don't count. Let's just brush that all under the rug. We're actually going to try it for real this time. It's like, yeah, look, don't get me wrong. You have the best of intentions. And I respect people for coming to a unique political view. But at the same time, we can call this what it is. It's dangerous. It is extremely dangerous what they are proposing, and they are doing it with the best of intentions. The road to hell is paved with the best of intentions.
Exactly.
And we know that to be true. Exactly.
And I also think it's utopian. It's deeply utopian. I had a friend of mine on the show a few weeks back who is a very dear friend of mine. We disagree politically. He's far more to the left than me. He is what you would describe as an anarcho-syndicalist, sort of like Noam Chomsky. And he and I had discussions. I said, well, okay. And we were sort of talking about defense. And we were sort of talking about, okay, how does an anarcho-syndicalist society have essentially a foreign policy? How do you do diplomacy? How do you do sanctions? How do you, because here's the thing, there are going to be countries in the world that are not like you. I think one of the things that these people do, and they don't do it unintentionally, I think it's an unintended consequence of it, is they just sort of assume that when our society accepts a certain form of sort of utopian socialism, that everybody's going to accept it. And so everybody's sort of on the same page. And because we're all on the same page, we're not going to have problems. But I sort of push back and say, okay, if you're going to have a society that actually goes towards sort of an anarcho-syndicalism or sort of utopian socialism, there are going to be a lot of countries who aren't like you. And you're going to have to figure out as a society how to interact with them, because we live in a world that is international now, whether people like it or not. I actually quite like it. I think it's good that we live in a global society.
The benefits are undeniable. I mean, the isolationist mindset in like a post World War II world it's just the height of lunacy to me.
I totally agree.
You want to roll back the clock 80 years.
Yeah. I mean, I recently just saw Darkest Hour, the film about Churchill, which was terrific. And in that film, you see him battling with people like Lord Halifax and the former Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who want to do a deal with the Nazis. They want to, they want to sort of appease him, give him Europe, and then he'll leave Britain alone. And there's this terrific scene where Halifax is
like your allies. That's noble.
Exactly, right? And there's this terrific scene, which has been in the trailers, where Halifax is arguing with Churchill, and Churchill says something along the lines of like, "You cannot negotiate with a tiger when your head is in its mouth." And that's exactly right. This is one of the huge points of diversion that I have with a lot of the modern left, and where I'm very much like you, where to me, the United States has a singular role in global peacemaking. That's part of what we do. And you could say and argue we've made mistakes. I was very critical of the war in Iraq, but I do think that the United States has this role because, we have allies, and our allies have responsibilities to us, and we have responsibilities to them. And regardless of the problems that we've had post World War II, and we've had many, whether it was the deaths in Korea, Vietnam, the Iran-Iraq war in the 70s, the Soviet intervention there, our interventions, on the whole, the world is dramatically more peaceful and prosperous than it's ever been. And the United States is a really big component to that. And to say, oh, well, we don't need to do that. We don't need to be a part of that anymore. We need to skirt our responsibility on that is really troubling to me. And that's also a big component of why I don't like Trump, is I don't like his isolationist tendencies. I don't like how he's really harming our reputation around the globe and our ability to use diplomacy to stave off global conflicts. So I'm definitely with you, and I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about your take on foreign policy and sort of where it fits into your sort of criticism of some of the left.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we obviously have a lot of agreements on this, which is refreshing to say the least. This is arguably the issue that I've received the most pushback on, if you'd believe it or not.
Right. Well, you're the only person I know on the internet within this space who describes themselves as a Wilsonian, as do I. So that was pretty cool.
Oh yeah, it's you're gonna make your fair share of enemies.
I know.
I think it's something that I definitely want to make more videos about, because I do view it as vitally important. I think that foreign policy is largely misunderstood, and what Trump's doing now, I've tried to give props where I could, even in the smallest ways. Like, I remember a lot of people were criticizing Moab, the mother of all bombs.
Oh yeah.
Which I thought was cool for, because I'm, immature like that.
It's pretty badass.
It was badass. Let's be real. And people, I remember, there was some stupid post. Someone they took the size of Moab, they put it over a map of Manhattan, and they said, this is how many people it would have killed in Manhattan. It wasn't dropped on Manhattan though.
That's like a complete non sequitur.
Yes, that is the definition of time wasting. And so it's that kind of stuff. But, in terms of the diplomacy, it's a joke. Now, I don't think we necessarily, we are a very independent country. We can do our own thing in a lot of ways, and that's okay. I don't want us to be subjected to some corporate, basically some shadow government, is some conspiracy nut would talk about. I don't want our autonomy as a country or our sovereignty taken away by all means, but there is such a thing as that level of pragmatism, talking about, okay, these are other countries in the world too. They also have power. We can't go to war with all of them. Like there needs to be some level of alliance. There needs to be some level of understanding and working with those countries to combat a real issue like climate change, or to work with NATO on an intervention in the Middle East. I think that for the most part, our foreign ventures have been very successful. And I do think it's in the best interest of a lot of people for us to criticize that faction of the left, because it's not just people saying, oh, I take issue with this one intervention. It's people saying, I take issue with this intervention, so therefore pull out of the world stage and just come home. Let's gut the budget and let's put it all into schools or roads or something.
Yeah.
I mean, there's, the size of the United States military budget should tell you something. Mm-hmm. It should tell you how drastically needed it is in the world. And I get people all the time like, oh, why it's be the world's policeman, which I think is the sign of social decay and that we're losing our identity as a country. When people are like, we're at that point where people are they're so anti-patriotic. They're questioning that. And it's like, okay, let me explain. I'm not necessarily happy about it all the time, but I understand it is a very necessary, vital position to fill. And if we do not fill it, a vacuum will be created and someone else will fill it. And I can give you a couple guesses who those countries might be. They're not very American in any sense. And, their format, structure, values, what they intend to do with the rest of the world. I, for one, even with Trump in charge, I am still very much a pro-U.S. leads the world type of person, because that, I believe, is the best way going forward for the world.
I totally agree. I mean, that was one of the few things that I was pleased with was I was comfortable with Mattis at defense. I thought that was a good move, which means Trump probably didn't make the move. Anytime there's a good decision that it's made out of the administration, there's a part of me that's like, man, I don't think he did that.
You have to keep in mind the military, it's largely its own thing. I mean, they don't change. Presidents come and go. They a lot of people have been there for a long time. They're professionals. And as far as I'm aware, they handle a lot of the decision making when it comes to how the wars are conducted. Not necessarily Trump's commander in chief is a very honorary title.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it reminds me very much, his time now in office actually reminds me very much of Reagan's second term, where Reagan had an incredible team of people who worked for him,
and dementia.
Yeah, it was dementia, but he did genuinely have a terrific team of people working for him. I mean, Secretary of State George Shultz should singularly, in a lot of ways, get a lot of credit for helping in the Cold War. I'm one of the people who you'll hear. This is what also makes me a little different. I'm a liberal who sort of likes Reagan, and I like the Reagan years.
Dun, dun, dun.
I don't agree with everything, but I think the foreign policy, particularly in the second term, is something worthwhile.
He's a likable guy.
He was a likable guy, and I do think that he had an incredible team of people who worked for him. People like Schultz, people like Colin Powell, who was his final national security advisor. And the United States, in my estimation, has always been a nation which seeks to, we've always sought to sort of spread our values around the world. And I think a lot of that's good, right? And so people who are sort of our compatriots on the left will say, well, isn't that sort of imperialism and things like that? And I would argue, possibly, but at the same time, my argument would be, what do we have to offer as a country? We're offering people a way to get connected with the international market. We're giving people the opportunity to have peace. We're giving people the opportunity to have sort of some forms of self-determination. You made a video a while back that I really, really liked, critical of Kyle Kulinski, where you were talking about his sort of problematic framing of our intervention in, I forget the country.
I think Niger.
Niger, yes, that was it. And you made a point of saying they asked us to come, that they wanted our help. This was an international effort.
And that is not a unique situation by far.
No, it's not. I mean, and I've even made an argument that had the United States gone into Iraq under grounds that sort of Christopher Hitchens talked about, where we sort of made it from the start, a humanitarian intervention. It wasn't solely about weapons of mass destruction. There's an argument to be made that that would have been a more successful framing for the public, and quite frankly, a more successful framing policy-wise. But no, I mean, this idea that somehow the United States should just sort of drop off of the world stage. To me, I totally agree with you. If we don't fill that leadership position, Russia and China and India and Pakistan and Iran will. And yes. How are they going to deal with North Korea? How are they going to deal with ISIS, right? How are they going to deal?
I won't be sticking around.
No, I think we'll probably all be dead. There's a place for the United States within the framework of international relations. I had a phenomenal professor in college who was a mentor of mine, who taught me a lot about international relations and diplomacy. My background's also in poli-sci. And for those who are isolationists, whether it's on the left or the right, it's a very emotionally appealing doctrine. It's very simple. When people say, like, the classic maxim of, alliances with many nations, entanglements with none. But it's like they don't really get what that means. Like, the United States has never really been an isolationist country. We've always sort of had a global role, even going back to the founders. One of the first things we sought to do was to establish diplomatic relations with France and the United Kingdom after we defeated them in the Revolutionary War. We had
because we were smart, because we valued we don't want the British coming back, and
exactly.
We certainly don't want France invading. Let's make it as friendly as possible.
Well, and people forget that one of the very first, if not the very first, authorizations of military force by the president without the first authorization of Congress was done by President Thomas Jefferson. It was fighting off the Barbary pirates off the Barbary coast, I think in like 1803. And the reason that he wanted to basically initiate a naval raid against the Barbary coast without Congress's approval was, it was part-time Congress at the time. They were out for the summer. When they came back for the winter, they would authorize the force. But that was very controversial at the time, but it was the right thing to do. And so that's sort of my whole thing, is this idea that the United States has always sort of like shirked its responsibilities to the world is insane. That just doesn't make any sense. We wouldn't be a global power if that was the case.
I really have to question a lot of people who whinge about imperialism. I remember I made a video a long time about this, and it was very controversial. I don't think it's a term that's applied very well all that often. And I think that there are examples that I could point to that you could describe as imperialism, positive results. There seems to be this very undue respect of just sovereignty in general, just sovereignty of nations. It doesn't matter the nation. It could just be any nation. It could be the most despotic dictatorship of all time, but hey, they have borders and technically a government. So, don't infringe on their land. Don't infringe on them as people. Don't exert any power over them. By all means, don't gain any political power or diplomacy for yourself as a country. It's always struck me as very strange, because it's just thrown out there as a buzzword, like the conversation's over. Oh, well, the United States does imperialism. The end. Good night. We're not talking about this anymore. You
could almost do like a sort of what I would call like a radical leftist bingo. So you could have like imperialist, colonialist, neoliberal. There's the other one.
Corporatist, corporate Democrat.
Yep. Yeah. You could do all of those. Yeah. To me, it's like, okay, fine. You've gotten out whatever ad hominem or whatever label you want to call me. Let's actually talk about the issue here. I think you've made a really great point about the issue of sort of governance and how it relates to imperialism. So, honestly, like, can't help to go back to it, but I'm thinking of Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels Over Nature, where he's talking about the global peace that happened after World War II. And he talks about how one of the ways in which the sort of post-colonial nations benefited from having an imperial power for so long was it actually set up an entire system of governance that was not there before. So in countries in Africa, or if you think of the former countries that were part of the Indian part of the British Empire, they had very strong consolidated, centralized, bureaucratic, and well-functioning governing systems because of the British that worked very, very well. And those then translated into governments that came after. And he sort of argues that, yes, there's a lot of bad stuff that happened because of imperialism, but there was some good. And some of that was sort of the civilizing process of global international governance and then governance within the country. So it's the problem with having these conversations is if I just even say something like this, somebody will call me a racist or somebody will call me an imperialist, but I'm just stating a fact, which is that these governments, the governments in these countries before weren't very good. They were very, very highly corrupt. They were very highly suspect to graft and whatever. When European powers set up governments, they became more uniform, they became more centralized, and they became more effective. That's not a value judgment on the people. That's just a fact of how that worked out. And so it's murky. The truth is always a little more murky than whatever talking point somebody has.
Of course. Oh, that would happen to Steven Pinker as well. Even no matter,
exactly.
Even as centrist as he is, it's so mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Just especially the racism accusations, like, say what you will, but undeniably Europeans just had a better system of governance. Europeans invented democracy. Like that was a totally unheard of concept. And honestly, a lot of the world doesn't have it still. And then we'll try to set up a democracy here or there. And, we catch a lot of flack. How dare you step on the sovereignty of these people? I hear this rhetoric about Iran right now, who I have advocated for aggressive stance against, given their ambitions. And I will stand by that, and I'll take the flack. I don't want you to take any flack if you don't agree, but I will take those bullets, because there is a lot of undue reverence for Iran happening within isolationist circles, and it's not just the left. I am actually working on a video right now about the alliance between right-wing and left-wing isolationists, and really how similar they are at the end of the day, and what they value, and in the world that they want to create, or at least will create by a result of their dumbassery. So that's worth pointing out. I mean, there is undue reverence given to Iran as a nation. They are an Islamic theocracy who want nuclear warheads. That's okay. Conversation over. We don't need to compliment these people. When did we lose our balls as a culture?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I guess my initial view of that is that one lesson of history that we can take with how we respond to Iran is, in many ways, I think what the first Bush administration did with the end of the Cold War. I think the leadership at the time, I think it was Secretary of State, I think it was James Baker, National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft. A lot of these guys, they were really brilliant. And I actually think Bush 41 was a pretty good president. I know he gets a lot of flack, but I think he was actually pretty good. And one of the reasons I think that is because the Cold War ended with a whimper and not a bang. And one of the ways that it did was the United States' strategic leadership in the region in ensuring the process of the transference of power from communist regimes to democratic regimes. And I think the United States has a very similar role here with Iran. So I don't know if a direct intervention is necessarily the case. I would need to learn a little bit more about it. But my initial
last resort.
Definitely.
But I wouldn't be opposed, and this has been done in the past, as I've been reminded ad nauseum. I would not be opposed to replacing their leader. I brought that up, and people were like, "Oh, that's been tried before." That was tried 60 years ago. It's a completely different country. Why? Yeah, it's amazing. That is practically a non sequitur. Oh, it's been tried before. Really has it? This is a unique circumstance that is not off the table at all.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I guess my general point was saying that the United States should not be hasty in its leadership. But I think at the same time, I do think that we have a very global and strategic role in ensuring the possibility of a democratic Iran.
You bring up a good point regarding the Cold War, and I think that opens up a fascinating conversation. So I've talked to a lot of people. They're non-interventionist, isolationist types, and they'll be like, the last good war was World War II, because, obviously Nazis. I mean, you gotta somehow then it's okay. But anyone else having political, imperial ambitions, just let them run amok. People will completely discount the Cold War and all the wars that we fought against them, setting up communist regimes. I mean, imagine the world today with a more isolationist United States that didn't bother to stop the spread of communism. Imagine what the world would look like today.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain moments, I think, that are incredibly important. I mean, one of, I think, the most important moments in American foreign policy is Nixon's 1972 trip to China. I mean, I think that, there's that classic maxim from Star Trek, only Nixon could go to China, and that's true. Nixon, for decades, had been a very fervent anti-communist, and only he could be in a position of strength to negotiate with a communist leader of one of the most populous nations of the world. And the fact that Nixon was able to do so much during that period of time, mind you, he was also a paranoid, corrupt fuck. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying, on the whole, you have to think about the fact that, with his leadership, you have the United States working on opening its relationships with China. You have, I think, what is it, the SALT, either say the SALT 1 or SALT 2 treaty with the Soviet Union. He did a tremendous amount of work in ensuring some sustainable forms of global peace. And maybe I'll get shit for saying that, but that's a fact. And the reason that the United States was able to do that was because we were in a position of strategic strength. And, we're never going to be able to succeed diplomatically or politically around the globe if we are, like I said earlier, if we're skirting our responsibilities to our allies, if we're skirting our responsibilities to the spread of democracy around the globe. And to me, it seems like the problem that I have with isolationism is it's such an ahistorical point of view. Yes. It's people who like to think of this stuff without any sense of context, without any sense of historical knowledge and previous relationships and previous foreign policy positions that the United States has taken. And it just shows me there's a naivete there that I find to be very problematic. And trust me, I mean, I remember 10 yeyears ago, my 14-year-old self would hate me now. I mean, my 14-year-old self was fuck all the wars and blah, 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 blah. But you get older and you realize the world is a really fucking scary place. And that the people out there around the world, they don't always share the same values or share the same concerns or share the same sort of ideals. They usually don't, right? And so when you have these kind of conflicts, what's better? The United States just saying, it's not our problem. Or the United States saying, no, we have a place in this discussion, because if we don't, there will be other problems down the road. And if we don't have a seat at the table, then chances are we're not going to be in a position to negotiate. We're not going to be in a position to benefit.
Yeah, who would care what the anarchist colony thought? I don't want to harp on your friend or anything.
No, you're fine.
It's just a whimper of a position. And
yeah, I agree.
We live in an era. I talk to a lot of people, and I'm constantly amazed at the selfishness. I will bring up an issue in the world, whatever it may be, the oppression in Iran, etc. And people will say, "Oh, that's not my problem." I'm for America first. And this is kind of the link between, that kind of Trumpian right-wing isolationist and someone like Kyle Kulinski, who's my bridges and my roads. like we don't have the money for bridges and roads and a military.
Right. Well, you made that point. It's like that meme of that little girl. Why not both?
Yeah. Why not both? I mean, how much money, the way these people talk, I don't think they understand that America has money. They see our debt and they're like, we're broke, nothing to spend. No, we have money. We're still functioning as a country and we have enough money for a bridge here and there.
Well, and it's such a bullshit talking point because neither party gives a fuck about the deficit anymore.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean,
and they also don't give a fuck about fixing infrastructure. So don't give me that bullshit.
Exactly.
Oh, but his party will be different, I'm sure.
Of course.
Oh, wait, the party that he left. Sorry, my bad. Yeah, low blow. I talk to these people. They're just, the way they're characterized to me is they're defined by their lack of empathy, their lack of sympathy, their selfishness. Oh, that's not my problem. I just want to focus on me here at home. These are my issues. That's the rest of the world. People dying because of ISIS. It's not my problem. And it's a kind of worldview that I can try to reach across the aisle. I can really try to understand. I can't understand that. I really can't understand that lack of humanism because, and it's so prevalent. Like, I hate to say like, this is a really prevalent social attitude, but it is. It really is. And I think, honestly, one of the most influential factors on that is internet culture. We have a lot of people who they themselves are isolated. And I don't want to sound like a total cuckoo here or like some Amish, down with the internet. But
no, you don't strike me as being a Luddite.
No. I mean, I'm on the internet, so I really don't have much room to talk. But
exactly, same.
I try to juggle it. I try to maintain, I try not to be on here 24/7. I try to maintain some social life outside of this. And there's a lot of people who just don't. And their politics are very reflective of that. That is, happens to one person, might not be a big deal. It's happening to millions of people. That's a big deal for our culture and for the future of our runs for president, anything like that. It is going to be extremely influential on the way we view politics. And I don't like it. Yeah. I don't. And I honestly don't have a solution. I wish that more people addressed it.
I totally agree. One of the things that I talk about a lot is the value of a civics education. That's a very old word, but it's a word that I like to use. It's a word I got from one of my history teachers growing up. Civics education. So, a knowledge of a sort of a working knowledge of American history, American government, econ, sociology. The problem with our American school system is that there's, for understandable reasons, whether it's, global economy, competition and things like that, there's sort of this overemphasis on the basics, math, science, and English. But I would say that one of the problems is that we don't really understand the value of citizenship in our culture. The real problem that I've seen over the last, in my knowledge, mind you, I'm only 27, so I can only, but in terms of what my study of history of America is, there's sort of a rabid, problematic individualism at the heart of what's going on in our culture. And what I mean by that is that, and you see this on both sides of the spectrum, this is something Lilla, again, talks about in his book, The Once and Future Liberal. You see this sort of rabid individualism, whether it's sort of the identity politics of the left or the identity politics of a right. It's firmly rooted in the I am me, and therefore me being me informs my view of the world, rather than sort of a here's my understanding of politics, here's my understanding of economics, here's my understanding of foreign relations or whatever, here's what I've learned, here's what other people are saying about this, what is the sort of the broader social take on these issues. There's this sort of emphasis on me. And because of that, we live in a culture that is completely without any reverence for institutions. Political institutions, social institutions, economic institutions. And because of that, people are just sort of a fuck you, I've got mine, who gives a shit about what's going on halfway across the world because I got mine, fuck it. I think that's a real danger. And I think one of the ways to combat that is a genuine civics education, reforming the schools. I mean, I know that's a fucking lofty goal, but it's one of the ways you do it is you actually teach the value of citizenship, because I liked what you were saying earlier about patriotism. I think patriotism is valuable. I think it is valuable. I think some people give it too bad a name. Part of that is because the right wing use it in some of the most disgusting ways imaginable. Sure. But it's the value of being a citizen, realizing that you're a citizen of a country, and then you're also a citizen of the world, and that it isn't just about you, and that you belong to a broader culture. And what you do and you have a responsibility to other people and to your culture and to your country. That is something that's completely lost. Part of that is just a culture that doesn't feel the impact of war. We've been at war now for nearly 20 years and the country barely feels it. That's kind of scary to me. When we went to war in World War I, the country felt it. You know, there was a draft, there was rationing, there was all kinds of social initiatives that made people understand the impact of the war. Same with World War II, same with Vietnam. But ever since then, it hasn't been. And that's a problem. I really do think that's a problem. I think that if we go to war, the country needs to understand the importance of that instead of saying, oh, well, you know, it's just another thing people are doing. We need to feel that on some level. And you know, whether it's some form of bringing back the draft, which I'm not necessarily for, but it's something I've thought about, whether it's creating a national volunteerism service where, you know, a person, instead of going into the military for a year, does some form of, you know, Peace Corps or community work or anything like that, some sort of civilian, you know, very much like a sort of New Deal style work program that would, you know, that would give people, nice. These are things we used to do as a country collectively that we don't do anymore. And I think a part of it goes back to just being too damned selfish. And that would be things I think that would help us reaffirm the understanding of citizenship.
There's a tremendous lack of appreciation. I mean, I was speaking earlier about people who sat the last election out, and I'll make fun of those people, but there's a good number of people who are just not politically involved at all. They live in America. They have the democratic right to vote. I mean, there are people around the world who would kill to have that power. And people will act like...
And there are people who died in this country to make it happen.
That's true. That's also true. People act like we have no impact on the government. That is blatantly false. People have a massive impact on the government at all levels. And these are not kings. Like, these are people who can be voted out if you actually get involved, if you actually care to be involved. I don't remember the figures of people, like the percentage wise, who turned up at the last election, but there was a good chunk of people who just didn't. But they're still going to bitch on Twitter about Trump. I have to question everything about that person and what they value. To have the power to vote for your leaders is a rare privilege in the world that many countries do not have. And millions of Americans spit in the face of that every day. And I can't understand it for the life of me. And it does go back to selfishness. It goes back to laziness. It goes back to not being educated enough. And it's depressing. It's really depressing. And I can't even really blame individuals too much, because it's just a system in general that doesn't care. And the politicians, they're totally fine with that. Hey, you know, ignorance is bliss. In fact, the more ignorant people, the more likely I am to keep getting elected. That's the sad state of affairs. They probably don't want more people voting, because if more people voted and they voted what would help them, a lot of these fuckers would get voted out. So they're not going to be raising awareness anytime soon to make any kind of real change, to have any real push towards changing the system. And I don't want to talk about changing the system like I'm some goddamn anarchist. But there are very real issues here. And there is such a thing as a bread and circus game. Like, okay, let's keep the people focused on this. Let's talk about this unimportant nonsense. But, you know, something actually important, some social initiative to get people more involved. Who's got the time? I mean, you know, Game of Thrones is on again. Okay.
Exactly. It reminds me very much of one of my favorite comedians is Bill Hicks. And he had this great bit where he would talk about, you know, it was like the government coming over, like your local television radio or something, local radio station or whatever, and say something like, you know, attention, the government is here to take care of you again. Sit down, shut up. Here, watch American Gladiators, watch big ass retards beat the living shit out of each other for your enjoyment. And they're benefiting you. And he ends it with, you are free to do as we tell you. And it's this whole thing about part of it, I think, and again, I think this is what makes me more left than a centrist, is that one of the problems with it is the fact that we do have such inequality in this country, where there are so many people who have so little and they have to work so hard for what little they do have. And you have these sort of extremely wealthy, very, very wealthy donors and the donor class. And this is both parties. I mean, the Republicans do it. The Democrats do it as much as the Republicans do it, where if they can placate the donors, who really gives a shit about the voters? And it's this sort of, and I don't know what the best solution to that is. I mean, because should we have direct funding, public funding of elections? Do we like the idea of candidates only getting public money? I mean, there's serious concerns there about, is money speech and things like that. And it's certainly not easy to see what answers the clearest on that.
It's a gray area. And yeah. I think that even if you opened up that channel completely, you can't compete with giant corporations. You just can't. You know, you can try to do your grassroots thing, but I don't see it ending that well. You could certainly try, and it's noble. And this is an issue that I have a lot of sympathy with leftists and progressive groups, even if I don't agree on a lot of other issues. I do think money in politics is a big issue. And again, I don't think the solution necessarily comes from the people in power. I've often said, what you're asking these people to cut their own paycheck, which I mean, think of the likelihood. Who would want to do that? I don't think there might be like one noble senator among them, but you need the courts, you need the executive branch. We need to stop looking to Congress for a solution to a problem that Congress is proliferating.
Exactly. The other thing that I've said for years, and it's something that we're seeing now more in this year and hopefully with next year, is Democrats actually starting to give a shit about local elections again, which is, I mean, nice. Mind-boggling to me. The fact that like for 8 fucking years, they let somewhere, what was it, over 1,000 state and local positions basically being flipped from Democrat to Republican. The vast majority of state houses are controlled by the Republicans. The majority of governors are Republican. The Democratic Party basically put all their chips in one fucking basket, which was the White House, because they thought, well, if we have the White House, we'll have everything else. This is one of the drawbacks of how the Democrats view it. I feel like sometimes there are people within the Democratic leadership who think the federal government is like the bee's knees, that it's the only thing that they should give a shit about. And fortunately, I do think that they're starting to care about local elections again. And I think that's really, really good. This is how you fight this sort of, if you're worried about the Koch brothers, if you're worried about Sheldon Adelson, if you're worried about these big money donors, that's the way to hit them back, is to, go to like a local city council race or a local mayoral race and like win it back. I mean, what we saw in Alabama was great. What we saw in Virginia was great. There's an opportunity for the Democrats to sort of pull their head out of their ass and figure it out.
Just the way it's celebrated, you can see a very clear shift in attitude from the Democratic Party in that regard. And I mean, if there's any criticism, that is a worthwhile one. This is when the Democratic Party thrives well. They thrive under the pressure of fighting back against Republicans in power. Very unfortunate that's when they thrive, because typically when they get in power, it is a lot of resting on laurels and just kind of, good enough.
They get very complacent. That's one of the only silver linings of Trump winning, is it like finally cleared out some of the decades-long rot that was in the Democratic Party.
I agree.
Hopefully changing it for the better. I wish it would have been under other circumstances, but on the whole, I mean, I still think it's a good thing. So, well, listen, Reece, you have been extremely generous with your time. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I consider you a fellow, champion of reason and sort of a sensible left politics, which I think is sorely needed in this space. And I'm so glad to have had you on the show. So where can people find your stuff?
My YouTube channel is Nightmare Fuel. I guess people might be confused, like, oh, you keep calling him Reece. I can't find the Reece channel.
I'm sorry.
I don't use. It's all good. I don't I feel like if that's the last comment I can make, it's kind of, I don't really refer to myself as nightmare fuel. Like whenever I've been on streams, like, oh, nightmare, do you have something to say? I have this moment of like cognitive dissonance, like, oh, they're talking to me. Oh, I'm just Reece. Like you could just call me my name. I'm Nightmare Fuel. You can find me on YouTube and Twitter is where I'm most active. I really appreciate coming on. I would love to come on another time. I'm sure we could find a lot else to talk about. Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the platform and being given the opportunity to speak about all this.
Likewise, I'm like I said, I am both a fan and a sort of compatriot in this space. So I appreciate you coming on the show, and you are definitely welcome back anytime.
Thank you. I appreciate what you do. I think that reaching out, speaking your mind about politics, and wanting to reach out and interview people, talk to people, let people know, and the community know that they're valued, that their perspective is sought after, is a great thing to pursue. And I'm fully in support of that.
Well, thank you very, very much. All right. Well, thank you so much. And we'll talk again soon.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Take care.
You too.
And that was my conversation with Reece. To visit his YouTube and support his work on Patreon, the links are in the description box. That's it for Reason Revolution this week. Please subscribe to us on SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, and now Google Play. If there's a platform you listen to podcasts on that I'm not on, please let me know, and I will try to make it happen. Send us your feedback at reasonrevolutionpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow our Facebook page at facebook.com/reasonrevolution. We are so close to 1,000 likes on our Facebook page. I'm so excited. Go over there and give us a like. Visit our brand new website, reasonrevolution.org, to keep up on all episodes, blogs, and additional content. If you would like to support our work, click on the support tab on our website. You can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at The Daily Clark. Until next week, this has been Justin Clark, and this has been Reason Revolution.